stretch water break. So we will keep moving on to Mr. Rudel, alternative sources of revenue. Some of this came back from some feedback from the board. I think we're always looking for sources of revenue. But we've shifted over the last year, and I think we've made some smart decisions on where funds get allocated in terms of gate receipts, going to security coverage and different things like that. So I think we're always looking to see, are there opportunities out there? We provide a lot of services. Are there opportunities for different type of revenues, fees, or charges? I mean, I think we have to be cautious as a public school what we're charging for, but I think it's always good to look at what the potential opportunities have been. I know we've looked at parking fees over the years. We've increased the parking fees. I think it's a privilege, and sometimes we have a parking challenge depending on the number of students. So I think all those things should be looked at. So I'll turn it over to you for kind of an update of your thoughts. Looks like you put together some good work about what some of our other districts are doing.
So we took a look at some of our peers in Fairfield County in terms of what revenues within their budget outside of what we already have. Just to recap what we already have, we have facility rentals, both field and buildings, summer school for DSS, pre-K tuition, parking fees, as was mentioned, shared services for technology, and then gate receipts. So there aren't that many other items that some other districts do have. Some include pay for participation in athletics. You can see from the chart below, about half the districts have it and half the districts don't. The districts that do have it range anywhere from $65 a sport to $225 a sport.
Do you have any insight what Ridgefield gets out of, or why $225? Has Susie elaborated?
So it hasn't actually increased since Susie's been there. Susie's actually tried to get it out of her budget. She wants to actually reduce the fee. Typically, it goes up because they're trying to raise revenue to reduce their overall budget costs. Most districts do have a family cap. Ridgefield is actually not one that has one. Typically, the family cap is 3 to 4 sports. So if you have, let's say, 2 children who play sports, and let's say your family cap is 3 sports, let's say both children play 2 sports, you won't pay for one of those 4 sports in that instance in terms of a family cap.
So in Ridgefield, the 225 is strictly for participating in sports.
Correct.
So you better not have 5 kids.
Yeah, with no cap. Right?
And I will say, it also doesn't mean you actually get to participate. It just means you're on the team. So it's not correlated with actually playing on the team, but just being on the team. Only a couple of districts have what's called a student activity or a club fee. That would be Joel Barlow in Reading, and then
Hey, Rich, could you just go back? You've got a bullet up here as a point of reference that the district charge all participants $135 above the average. The district would collect $106,000.
Correct.
This would exclude squash, hockey, skiing, and sailing, which already have a charge.
So the district already has participation fees for those 4 sports. And it's primarily because the cost of those sports are much greater than that of the other sports that we have in the district.
I'm going to ask the question, although I'm sure it's not. Is there a consistent fee, or is it different for each of those sports?
It is different for each. The split is consistent between what the board pays and what the parents pay, but the overall cost of the sport does vary. So for example, skiing is a little bit more expensive than squash. So skiing pays a little bit more, same with hockey, but the ratio is the same. It's a 70.
Is there an average as to what the charge is?
Right?
It's a
70, 30, yeah, that's
70-30 split.
Is there an average that they're paying there amongst those sports?
Well, hockey could be up to $1,000, and then like squash, I believe, is $375. So there's a big range between the two, but it is a 70-30 split.
Yes.
Good. So based on last year's population of student athletes, excluding those 4 sports, if it was a $135 fee, which is really just the average of the districts who do charge, there's no real magic number for the 135, you would collect the $106,000. And then obviously that would fluctuate based on the makeup every year of who participates in what sports. We also looked at student activity and club fees. Most districts do not charge a student activity or club fee. The 2 in Fairfield County that we found that did are Joel Barlow and then Wilton. Joel Barlow is only a high school. Wilton actually does charge at the elementary, middle, and high school level. So it is $50 a fee, and there is no cap. And that's just used to offset some of the after school kind of like enrichment clubs that might exist within the school district.
So do you know, go ahead, Dennis.
Is this on top of, so both of these schools have paid for
So it's on
participation in
top of
athletic,
that.
those are
So it's
additional?
on top of that. Yep.
And is this, do you need to participate, or is it mandatory that everybody pays
You
this?
need to
50?
participate.
You need to participate.
Correct.
And when you say clubs, you mean just like those clubs at
So,
like the
like,
high
if you do,
school, like
like,
the
the newspaper-
Spanish club?
Like if you
and
do
like
the Spanish club or a newspaper club or, yearbook or whatever it might be, those are the fees that you're paying.
So I guess the other thing is you always, it's easy to kind of single out athletics and have a participation fee, but then you talk about a student activity fee and you reference clubs, but does that include theater, music, any of choir? Does that
Yep, so
include?
anything that's considered, like, so we call them clubs and councils here. So
Okay.
anything that would be the equivalent of a club and council.
But choir is a class, the
Correct.
curriculum. It's not a club.
So
Neither is
anything that's
band
a
or
club and
orchestra.
council would be the equivalent of what like Wilton's charging.
Thank you.
Yep. And then the third one is non-resident tuition for staff of school employees and town employees. It is usually charged at 25% of the calculated per pupil. This is typically negotiated first with your teachers union because they are your largest base of employees within a school district. So you can see Newtown, Easton Reading, Ridgefield, Wilton, Westport, and Weston all do charge per pupil. Some districts charge just 25% of whatever the NCEP is that's published by the state. Others actually take a more nuanced approach where they deduct certain things that might be part of your per pupil costs, like special education tuition and utilities, and then they actually break it down between elementary, middle, and high school, and so you have a different rate for all of those. If a student, none of the districts that are listed here that we contacted, but if a student is special education, they actually have to pay the full cost of special education for those services. If they're non-resident tuition, typically it doesn't happen because those parents don't want to necessarily have to pay, $50,000 or $60,000.
The parent would have to pay the cost. There's no way to,
Oh.
they choose to do their
So
education
it's a parent who
here.
might, let's say, live in like Danbury, and maybe they work in Darien. They want to send their kids to Darien. They're paying that tuition to have the right to send their kids here. They obviously don't get any transportation to go here from Danbury to Darien.
Right.
But they pay a tuition, which is typically 25%.
And the fact that they're getting their education here, there's no way to charge back to that district for any special
No,
services.
because they're making the choice to send their.
So what happens mid-year, a child's identified and needs an IEP?
So you'd have to pay the difference for those 6 months, or the parent would have to unenroll their student and send them to their own district.
Yeah, Mr. Brown.
What's our current per pupil, Rich? Sorry.
We're just over 20,000, we're around $21,000.
Thank you.
So just to stay here for a second, in my time on the board, this has come up. It's kind of been discussed at a high level. I know certain folks in town on the RTM and all bring it up, pretty regularly in terms of, when we talk about teacher turnover or what teachers are looking for. In my tenure on the board, it's never come up where we've got to the point of negotiating it or building it into a contract, Marge. And so, and again, too, this depends on a lot of work being done behind the scenes as to what would the potential enrollment be? How does that affect our over enrollment numbers? Is it strictly for teachers? Is it a separate agreement for administrators? And then if you're doing it for teachers and administrators, how does that play into the police department and town employees? So it's just this kind of very broad conversation.
In the districts that are listed here, it's not a very popular item, and they typically range anywhere from 2 kids to 7 or 8 kids, so it's not a huge amount. Some districts do limit it just to teachers. Some actually do any public school staff employee or town staff employee. And some districts also do just public school staff employees, but no town employees.
So I will say, I
Sure,
came,
Mrs. Parent.
came from the independent school world, and this is a very prevalent practice in private schools. And it does tend to attract excellent talent because it is a huge, it's a huge bonus. But I see that there's a lot of issues surrounding it, but it's a great carrot, but there's a lot of issues when you're talking in a public school situation.
I mean, I could see, I don't know, Marge, if you have any information, it becomes, depending on the age of the kid, it just becomes a long day for the child, depending on, we have teachers that commute well over an hour.
So I
to get here.
administered this in Westport, and if they only have 7 or 8 now, then it's become a lot less popular than when I was taking care of it. To some parents, it's really important.
Sure.
The teachers union hasn't signaled yet that it's important to them here, but we have negotiations coming up. So.
Okay. Any other thoughts or questions or comments around this?
Around
Around this one. Yeah, Mrs. Tran.
Marge, I'm just curious in your interview process, if you ever, there's a great person out there and they say, sorry, I can't take it because it's too far away from my kid. Like, would this?
No,
how
but the
often-
exit interviews, it's being, more common. Stanford will let teachers bring their students, and so will Greenwich. In Greenwich, they also make $20,000 more than they make here, so it's hard to figure out which is the
Mm.
motivating factor. But we've had a few this year who've gone to Stanford because their kids can go to school with them.
And it's you don't have it here, Rich. Is Stanford a similar type tuition share?
It's 25%.
25% of their cost per pupil. Okay. But Marge, to Sarah's point, it doesn't come up in initial interviews.
No.
It's come up more on the back end. That's interesting. Okay, all right. So do we want to back up? And I think, I don't know, in my view, there could be a athletic fee, a student activity fee, or there just could be a combination of one fee. So, I mean, who wants to start the conversation?
I
Mrs.
have a
Warren?
question.
Sure.
Would the student activity club fee, if it was, would it also include, like, if you just did the student activity club fee, would
It
it
could.
also include athletics?
That's why I brought it up. I'm like, you could say, here's a student fee, and that could encompass whether they play sports or theaters. I think, I don't know, we would have to figure out where these actual dollars actually go to.
So
Right.
typically, whether it's the athletic participation fee or the club fee you see for Wilton and Joe Barlow, it's shown in the operating budget because that's where the expense is, whether it's for athletics or if it's a club. So you usually see a revenue account listed. Money's collected through whatever your mechanism for us, school cash online, whatever your mechanism is for collecting revenue, student activities, and then the check is written similar to parking fees or gate receipts.
So if we put in a athletic fee, where does that go in terms of the athletic budget?
So you'd see a line item in RC 11
Just
called
for
participation
revenue?
fees. And it would show revenue and it defers the cost of the sport. So the 4 that you already charge right now gets netted against the rental fee for like the ice hockey rink, the ski slopes, things like that. So you just have a contra expense line item called participation fees. And let's say that's $100,000. So RC 11 would be $100,000 less. I will say, right now, the district does have voluntary participation fees for some athletic sports. It's likely if you had a participation fee that's adopted by the board, you're probably not going to collect those participation fees that are voluntary. So some of those fees pay for kind of like the nice to haves that Chris Manfredonia would, describe. So you might not get the nice to haves, or you'd have to come up with some other way to get it, whether it's a different type of fundraiser or an event or something like that.
But are you saying that if you did $100 athletic fee, you take that $100 for the 30 or 40 kids that are on football, and it doesn't go to the specific costs associated with football, it just goes to the overall athletic RC. You're not breaking it down almost by GL, are you?
So you can have org accounts within our chart of accounts, which segregate by sport. So you're not actually spending,
Right.
per se, the money that you collect from the parents. So if, let's say, you collect $10,000 for a specific sport, you're not taking that money in and then cutting a check against that. It's really just a contra account to reduce
Right.
overall
Okay.
expenditures.
All right, Mrs. Best.
Rich, did you look at what the numbers looked like if squash, hockey, skiing and sailing did the 135 and then you evened it out across so that every sport was at the same price?
I didn't. We certainly could. It would definitely be a big drop in revenue for those sports, and then the board share of the rental fees for those sports would be obviously significantly
Okay,
greater.
because I guess if we're looking at this just as a straight revenue opportunity versus as an equity builder or leveler or whatever the right terminology is, might be interesting to look at it that way also.
So Rich, too, the other thing that I think in some ways we were trying to solve for is we moved the gate fees to a different account, which then depletes an account that we used for certain senior high school events.
So that was parking fees. The gate-
Parking fees,
The
sorry.
gate receipts typically we actually sweep every year, and then it kind of sits in the district account. The parking fees have typically paid for like senior events, whether it's like ice cream socials or trips or things like that. So the expectation, going forward is there'll be a request made from the district student activity account to fund those. Some districts listed here have a voluntary fee for seniors, let's say. They collect that money in the student activity account, and then it gets paid out for that senior event.
I think that covers kind of my thought process. Mr. Sini.
Thanks for bringing this topic to light. I was reading Wilton does local advertising at its stadium and raises $50,000. I think they set up a 501c3, within. So there's various other ways that you can do it, and it's pretty interesting if you go up there. It's like US Open advertising, like dual colors, the Wilton Warriors colors. But I guess, I don't think it's something for action, but it's something to think about as you mentioned equity among sports. Some sports, there's a lot of skin in the game, if you will, and others zero. Certain activities there aren't. So I think to your question, we'll never make it equal, if you will, but you might be able to solve a bit for equity, and then also the taxpayer would benefit a bit. If we do choose to implement this in the future, I would say there should be ample room for scholarship opportunities based on need. But I think, as a parent that's had 3 active boys in the district, I kind of feel very fortunate that I don't play hockey or squash or ski, but at the same time, I'd be willing to put in a nominal amount to, again, have a bit of skin in the game in terms of the activities that the schools and the rest of the taxpayers are supporting. And then if there's a way that we can solve for that senior account, if you will, or student activity account, that also solves that future issue. But as I understand it, it's not, you have a pretty big balance right now, right?
So we have about a little over $75,000 in the district account. So it's going to be a number of years before you get to the point where you don't have anything to fund scholarships and then senior events.
So Rich, I think if I go back in my tenure, and I don't know, Jill, some of the policy experts may know, I think DAF brought to the table advertising at scoreboards or different things like that. And it seemed to be a taboo conversation to kind of commercialize some of that stuff. But I think to the point of other towns that I've seen, whether in Connecticut or Long Island or New Jersey, you can always also keep it local. Like I'm sure the Darien Sports Shop would be one of the first to step up and potentially advertise on a scoreboard, or any of the other local stores or shops and stuff like that. So, to me, I think that's a worthwhile conversation. I mean, we DAF does such an incredible job. You got DAF Media, are there electronic means of promoting local businesses that do a lot to support the community, the schools, and the athletics? And are there advertising opportunities? I don't think it should be a taboo conversation.
So for some of the districts like Wilton that have advertising, or even New Canaan, the money actually doesn't go to the board. It's going to the booster clubs there. I will say with New Canaan, however, you'll actually see in their budget a credit from the boosters that they actually give to the Board of Ed to pay for some sports. But it doesn't necessarily always go directly. I mean, you certainly could have a policy where the board creates a policy that says yes to X amount of advertising on certain fields, puts parameters there, and then that money would obviously come to the Board of Ed to offset. But you'd have to have some type of policy or structure to what you would and wouldn't accept.
Mrs. Parent.
I'm just going to share my opinion on the clubs and councils one. I'm not sure how I feel about the athletic one yet, but I feel clubs and councils, to me, leaves a really charging for that, leaves a really bad taste in my mouth. We want well-rounded people, children who do lots of additional things and enhance their minds and open their broaden their thinking, and to charge for that seems, it doesn't seem right to me right now.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm fine with having kids that play sports. I'm fine with an athletic fee. I don't love the club fee, because you're part of Spanish club, feels like a little,
Same with theater,
How do you draw that distinction?
oh, well,
from
theater,
equity?
I don't know. I just mean these little clubs that are they get together, 5 of them, and they're members of
Or if it's
geography club,
the GSA or any of those that happen.
seems like-
that doesn't seem right.
What are the budget impacts of most of those clubs? I think
Right.
they're pretty
Right.
minimal,
Yeah,
aside
that's
from the
It's really just the stipend
stipend
that you
for
pay
the
to whoever
faculty
leads,
advisor,
yeah.
right? So they are in kind of different categories, to
Right.
my way of thinking.
So you're thinking of it educational versus extracurricular? Is that how you're going? I'm just trying to.
Yeah, I guess so.
understand.
I mean, I think athletics, to me, it's an extra. right? And I don't know, that's the way that I think, but it's hard to separate, like to your point, is theater included in that? It's a gray area for me.
I don't know that I have a good understanding of what the club budgets look like, to be
No, I
perfectly
don't either.
honest. I don't know
That's a
what
good
sort of
point.
transportation costs are in there. We look at athletics very carefully every year, so I feel like much more fluent in what goes into running our athletic program, but our extracurricular clubs and councils, I don't have the same familiarization with, and that would probably be helpful to know to be able to weigh in on this.
Oh, I didn't notice.
Welcome, Mrs. Ackerman.
Why are we looking at that? Because I absolutely agree with Susie's question, right? So where do you draw the line? So I guess the question is, why are we exploring?
I think I teed it up that several board members have said they'd like to just look at what are potential other sources of revenue. And so these are some of the things that came out of it. Participation fee, athletic fee. We just talked a little bit about advertising and signage and stuff like that. So just to have a
So I support.
What's that?
And
student activity.
That I see, I agree with this parent, we're looking at well-rounded kids, I don't think revenue on kids. So if that's the goal, I'm uncomfortable assigning a fee to say, we want you to explore and try new things. And for me, sports fits the same as a category. My kid's passionate about geography, or my kid's passionate about being cheerleader. I don't want them to explore either. So I don't know that I support revenue on these activities in the public schools.
Before you walked in, I also raised the equity issue in that certain sports are paying large amounts. And I guess we are, as you put it, making revenue off of those kids. So from an equity standpoint, I said as a parent, I'd be comfortable to have some skin in the game for my child to participate and pay a nominal participation fee, where right now we have, a good group of parents paying lots of fees and others paying zero. So that is the part of the why question that you just asked.
I also,
Go ahead, Mrs. Ward.
I'm fine with the advertising. If you're looking, I would probably, if you're looking to offset some of the costs from sports, I think the idea of local advertising, absolutely, why not? Instead of charging fees.
Mr. Brown.
Just following up on Ms. Ackerman's point, I think this is a small rounding error in her budget. The other point is, as a parent of 2 high school hockey players, I've yet to find the free ice hockey program anywhere. And it was my decision as a family and my kid's decision to play. So yeah, we're going to pay for ice time. It's just cost of doing business. So I don't want to speak for every hockey parent in town, but it kind of goes with the territory if that's what you're going to do.
Yeah. Thank you. Is there any additional, I think to some of your comments, Julie, is there any additional information the board would like to see to continue the dialogue? I mean, I think the equity conversation is a big conversation. We've kind of gone down at this retreat over the many years I participated. We've gone down the sports conversation, the equity conversation. I think we've made progress over the years. Is there more work that wants to be, that we feel we need to do there, or more information we need to see, or? Yeah, Mrs. McCammon.
I would second Mrs. Worm, and I forget who else said it. But I would love to see a little bit more about advertising. I think that, if that could be a way to offset some of the things that our parents pay. I think, and possibly in some number of years, refill that student activity account, et cetera, and make a difference to our taxpayer. All those 3 things would, I think, be good outcomes. So I'd love to just know a little bit more about that. A little bit more information about who does it, what they do, how they regulate it. Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
I would just rebut that with, as much as I love saving taxpayers money, I think if we get into advertising, that we've had conversations or people bring issues, who's supporting water, their slush funds was a word that was used at one point. I'd rather just keep this as clean and simple and transparent as possible. And I'm fearful that if we went down the advertising road, those recriminations could come back fairly or not.
Mrs. Bass.
I would just ask if we move forward with this discussion, that we also take into consideration the curricular classes that do have costs to parents associated with them, the uniforms required for participating in orchestra, choir, and band.
Mrs.
I guess, is there
Barron?
consensus that we even want to move forward with this conversation or?
And that's what I'm asking.
Well, I would be fine not charging any.
Mr. Maroney, let's
I
get
I
everyone's
honestly
thoughts.
think we've had this discussion for years. I mean, I don't know how long ago the board charged an athletic participation fee and then it took it away. So I think, for me, I think Mr. Brown summed it up well. I think there are 4 sports that cost something. And we've, I think, made it as equitable as possible where the board, the district puts in the same amount, percentage of money to those sports and the rest are free. And I think that's about as fair as we can be, because I think as you start going down and start debating whether geography club or whatever other clubs there are, which one rises to the level of an athletic sport and which one doesn't is really hard to parse. And I think to Mrs. Achman's point and Mrs. Parent, I think that's the joy of being in high school. You get to try these different things. And that's what we should be paying students to do and become well-rounded students.
So is there any further action we want to take on this or any further information you want right now? We don't want to pursue the advertising?
I would too.
No? Tara,
I'm
advertising?
happy with looking into it. I mean, it doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I don't think it hurts to look
I
into
guess
it.
I don't have really strong feelings about any of this.
Rich, is that a lot of work to figure out who's using their signs or scoreboards?
I mean, we could reach out to some of the districts that do it and see how it works there.
It rounds out the amount of information we have as we think through these things.
If we do that, we just also make sure, like, what are the legal parameters, like, what legally we accept or deny, right? Because we can't all often have good conversations about employees, private businesses, paying, advertise. I agree with Mr. Brown, like, I just don't want to open up a wormhole. So if we went down this, I'd just like to know what the parameters, and we have to be okay to those parameters, but like, we can or we can't limit certain things.
Well, I think I mean, all good points. I just like to understand how other districts do it. I think our focus would be using or sticking to local businesses, and then how does that work from a legal standpoint?
Mr. Chairman, is
Yeah.
it the board's intent to try and do the background on this and possible anticipation of budget time? Is that what I'm just asking?
But if we get the information, and
I think.
if
let
you
us-
have time by then,
Yeah,
if not.
Okay.
good. Thank you. We'll move on to student discipline practices, Dr. Adley and Dr. Tranberg. So I think earlier in the day when Mr. Mooney was here, I discussed a little bit, I think, feedback that I've gotten from board members, calls and feedback I've gotten from parents, conversations that Dr. Adley and I have had, and I've had conversations with Mr. Mooney also was, is there anything more we need to do around discipline? I think when, we've had some serious incidents where discipline has had to be handed out, and immediately people don't necessarily think from what their student got to what another student got was fair, even though most of this stuff, or all of it, should be kept private because it's specific to students, but inevitably everyone hears about what discipline everyone got. So, I wanted to make sure, and it goes back to our morning conversation around communication. Is there anything we need to do differently, or is there an annual update we need to give around discipline? And that there is, a handbook, there's commitment, there's how to be a good student, how to be a good athlete. And are there, you violate some rule in the handbook, it equates to some type of discipline, and then an issue over and above that, like some of the challenges we've had, involves more of an investigation and then an administrative decision around what the discipline is. So, Mr. Mooney thought it was a good conversation to have. He said, I think there's a path you go down to make sure people understand the board's role in discipline and the administration's role and the local school administration role in discipline. So that's kind of where this came up, how this came up through. So turn it over to you to Dr. Tranberg or Dr. Adlet.
Yeah, I'll just talk to this if you don't mind, just
Yeah.
for the moment. Chris can chip in where he would like to do that. So this is just to give you a wee bit of a sense of kind of, I was asked to do this in the sense of just an overview of discipline, where we are with it, consistency, otherwise, and some other topics in there. I will say this just as a frame of reference. The discipline issues in the district, in the bigger picture, the number of incidents that sort of rise to, I will call them sort of serious incidents, are not as many as you might imagine. They may be profiled. You yourself or otherwise may have heard about them, and those ones are can continue to gain momentum or otherwise or interest. But since 1718, the number of incidents that we need to report to the state that are really resulting in sort of suspensions or otherwise, right? Suspensions in school, out of school, expulsions, that type of stuff. I mean, they have reduced by 54%. Right? You're down to like mid 40s of actual incidents of that particular nature. That is minuscule in the bigger picture. Now, I'm not saying there's not issues going on.
When you say 40, is that 40 incidents?
40 incidents.
A
Over
year?
over the course of a year.
Correct.
Okay.
So for the size of, when you look at the size of the schools we're talking about, I just want to keep that in perspective because I think that's a, David?
41, just go back to stuff.
So I'll round it up to, let's say 17, 18 to 100 is 90. So it's now reduced down to 44, 45 particular incidents, discipline incidents.
Consists of expulsion, suspensions.
Yes. Yes.
So what's the level at which you need to report?
So suspensions, in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, and any other substance abuse or otherwise incidents. So, and that, I just want to just reassure you in the sense of, listen, it is what it is, right? So we'll address it in any particular context, but I just want to give you the big overview of that. There are certainly incidents that come to your attention and are also maybe profiled and known about in the school and so on and so forth. But that being said, that's a sort of review of it. I will say that, I mean, the last 2 years, 2.5 years, basically, is a different context to some degree. Now that we're all back, the main pattern of behaviors are issues of disrespect to each other, aggression towards each other. And this actually is K through 12. It's not necessarily just the high school. How to interact with each other again, how to interact with adults. So those types of, I'll call them disrespectful behaviors, inappropriate use of language, so on and so forth. And now, obviously, we have dealt with this year incidents of anti-Semitism, inclusion issues, all of those types of things obviously are also, that's also a picture of kind of some of the stuff that's going on. But the basic main pattern of behaviors is this disrespectful behavior and interactions with each other and also with adults. So I just want to give you that big overview. First of all, prevention. I'll address a couple of issues, then just open up the floor. The idea, by the way, of the vision of the graduate is a little bit like a manual. A manual is one thing, right? But it's like for employees going through the manual. Not everybody does that, and how helpful is that? The idea of values, mission, vision, portrait of the graduate, having those embedded into the culture and climate of the school for both for adults and students is kind of where you want to be at because people know that intrinsically, and that's a part of who they are and how we behave towards each other. So the preventative discipline that takes place in a lot of different places, everything from now obviously this is developmental, right, in terms of the elementary school versus the secondary schools. Advisories, responsive classroom developmental guidance. Certainly the commitment meetings are also part of that particular process, and communication between home and the school. Basically our policies, which have just revised, and the handbooks outline where kind of how we interact and how we address discipline. They're in different places of developmentally and comprehensiveness. that the high school being the most comprehensive in nature. Discipline is often, is primarily, I would say, progressive for consequences. And listen, I should say right up front, and I have in this memo, that it is important for student learning to have a healthy learning environment. And consequences, natural consequences, are part of that particular process. Progressive discipline it happens, but it's also, you could be given an incident, it's complex, it's just not as simple. Let's say you have an handbook, you get this for this, and then the next incident you get something else. Well, it doesn't make any sense perhaps it doesn't make any sense if you've given a consequence for a student, let's say at the high school in September, and something happens in June. And it would say, well, if you had the first offense this and the second offense, well, does anything happen in between? The space of when things happen matters, the context of it. You want to look, you certainly want to look at every situation. It's very easy to sort of casually opine on discipline when it's our own students, my own child or otherwise. You'd want us to look at that independently at all the factors and take everything into consideration. And that's what we do for every situation. Whether it sort of fits, they should be getting this consequence or otherwise. From high school right down, they look at the individual child, they look at the situation, they look at typically what would be given for this, and then there's a response that is made. So everything has a wee bit of a different connotation. If you were to say, this is, make one up, stealing. Well, stealing, do you get the same thing for stealing? Well, that's all different connotations. What did they steal? How did they steal it? The context of it. The whole story behind it has to be looked at. And I want to reassure you that from high school down, your administration looks at all of those situations and tries to be fair to the students, to the families, and also consistent. I will say that they have really tried to be consistent. It talks about in here, administration coming together to look at each cases. It wouldn't be unusual for me to be involved in cases in terms of listening, giving advice, so on and so forth. So those types of things happen in terms of to try and develop consistency. There are consequences that are in handbooks. They primarily talk about in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension. You can only really suspend someone out-of-school suspension now for really safety matters per se. Everybody otherwise has to be in-school suspension. We have not had expulsions in my time period, so just as a frame of reference there. So it is, but it is, in general, it's progressive in nature. Yes, you would expect to see if someone does something, they get X, and then maybe the next time they should get Y. In general, that has happened, but it's not just exclusively that. There are restorative practices. I can't tell you that they, again, I'll say for the high school, because that's for the majority of the incidents occur. The idea of restorative practices is very, very prevalent and is used extensively, whether it was a consequence or whether it was not a consequence. And that's often really revolves around maintaining relationships with each other, and if those relationships have broken down, to try to facilitate an understanding with each other. Yes.
So I know that there are, outside people and mediators and whatever that do some restorative work.
Yes.
Is that something that the district uses, or is it internal?
So sometimes that would be the case. Sometimes for objectivity, sometimes there are cases, whether it's to actually research it, like you can say whether it's bullying or intensive cases, sometimes for objectivity, just the same way as the board has designated an independent counselor to oversee some of the serious matters of discipline in terms of expulsion hearings and so on and so forth. Occasionally we would do the same thing, have some independent, because it's very, very complex, or it's so extensive that I honestly don't have a staff member who has the time to actually go through those particular steps. So the answer to that is yes. Not always, but it just depends on the situation. There's calibration that I said about between administrators. We also have the Safe Climate committees that have to look at data from patterns of bullying or behavioral data and patterns. So they address that, and that involves confidentially some parents, right? But you can't we can't talk about individual students, it's just patterns. So they have to review that, and that's part of the case too. I mentioned about the behavior trends. They're more social and interactive and relationship based. I understand from a board's point of view, sometimes it's hard, and from a parent point of view, sometimes it's hard to see the consistency, whether it's involving an athlete or a non-athlete. I can tell you that we strive extremely hard to maintain consistency. I can say that the ones that I have been involved with, I can look any parent in the face in terms of athletics or otherwise, that to my knowledge, what we have administered has been consistent. I can honestly say that. I believe that to be consistent. Whether it's the right one or the wrong one in terms of the amount of consequence or otherwise, the parent may or may not agree with that, but I can just say that it has been consistent, and we've been striving to do that. So I'll leave the discussion there for the moment. I'll open up for any questions that I have.
Mrs. McCammon.
A couple, but I'll start with PD around some of the responsive aspects of discipline. I know we do a lot of PD for ruler and for responsive classroom, et cetera. But do we do any PD more about when you're reacting to an incident, or PD around restorative practices, or, you know, do we do that for staff? And is that, would that?
We haven't rolled out. We have done some restorative practices, but we haven't rolled out anything like this district-wide, you know, for all the staff.
Okay, thank you.
We've been working on the behavioral side of SRBI.
Yeah.
So we've done quite a bit with the academic interventions over the years, but there's a whole behavioral side that's in development to treat behavior just as you would the academic piece, because they're not independent of each other, as you know.
Thank you.
And if I would just add to that, we've also done restorative practice training for administrators. Our school climate coordinator, Dr. McCarthy, has done training with administrators on restorative practice.
Okay, thank you.
From my own point of view, I tend to believe that the kids in general, this may be naive, you may think, but I tend to believe the kids rise to the expectations that we set for them in general. I mean, if you look at a different instance, you may not agree with that, but if you're asking my own personal philosophy on discipline, I do think clear expectations are critical. Fairness is critical. But I also believe in giving the kids the benefit of the doubt, and also hold them responsible, but also just supporting them through it and letting them rise to the expectation.
And after the fact, you don't want the behavior to reoccur. Like, that's ultimately the purpose of a consequence, whether or not it's a traditional detention or suspension, or if it's restorative. So with the most important part about any restorative approach, just because something's restorative doesn't mean there's not a consequence. There can be restorative consequences, obviously. But there's the part of, are you trying to mend the relationship between, say, it's two students? Or is it, there's often an instinct, and it actually happens in elementary more, is please keep my child away from this child, and I never want them to talk to them ever again. And when it's kindergarten, they have a long way to go. So, but you want to try to restore, whether or not it's a 5-year-old or if it's someone who's 18, because that's the way of the world. And while we know things we know, like discipline and Saturday schools and suspensions, we know those are traditional consequences, but we also know that they're not very effective in changing behaviors.
Okay.
Mr. Brown.
Just hearing a lot about restorative, do we think at all about retributive? And that if you violated the norms of the school, that there will be a punishment, you should actually, be made and held to account by the community for that? Or is it just a restorative approach?
Oh, it's not just restorative. There's absolutely times, and there's easier times when a behavior is there's a direct consequence that makes sense. And some of those are in the high school handbook, like when you're late this many times, this consequence is.
Got it. And I just think in the context of what Dr. Adley was talking about, if you do lay out prescriptive or, a series of prescriptive events, and then for whatever reason, there may be mitigating factors where we don't follow through, the adjudication's there, but the actual consequence varies. Then I think purely restorative, people realize maybe the standard is slippery and they aren't going to be held. So I just don't know how we balance those two interests in this setting.
Yeah, I think it's a case by case depending on the situation.
Thank you.
How often do you revisit the punishments or the restorative practice and, make changes to your reaction?
You want to just elaborate on that a wee bit? Just
Well,
what do you mean?
Well, try not to think about a specific instance and give an
No,
example, but again, if there's community outcry, maybe the community doesn't understand, is it just trying to understand how you react to the outcry on the community level or the parent level. Is there introspective work? Is, hey, maybe we were a little too light, let's just say, on this punishment. And I'm just trying to get a sense of how often you kind of revisit your practice of punishment and.
Oh, totally regularly on a case-by-case basis, definitely. Particularly serious cases, there's contemplative reflection on the administration of the discipline, the consequence initially, and then afterward, do we learn anything from that? And that's saying we haven't learned anything from our discipline cases. Absolutely, all the time.
So I think maybe to that point, I think the thing that I've gotten the most feedback on, and I've looked through here and I'm not sure it's really laid out, and I'm not sure whether it should be or shouldn't be, but I think part of the challenge that I've heard in 3 incidences particularly is the process of the investigation and kids being taken out of the classroom, brought to assistant or assistant principal's office, and a questioning immediately started. And so that raises the question of where's the parents' involvement here? And there may be a question of kids being 18 years of age or not, but that's been, I think, a challenge in some of these instances, is the parent wanting to be part of that process. And so what is that process? I mean, I've heard that we have the right to take a kid out of the classroom, bring them to principal, assistant principal, or hearing officer, and have a meeting, like getting the facts. So, but I don't see that outlined here. And like, how do the parents know that and understand that? And how do the parents know where they, and so if the kid refuses to answer, then that's okay until a meeting is set up with the kid and the parent?
So look, the administration tries to be cooperative with people. That's kind of where we come from. But at the same time, we have to run a school system, a high school, right? We can't, every time there's an issue of, depending on what level it is, that I have to call the parent for the parent to come in and interview and so on and so forth about every issue. But if a student doesn't want to respond, then that's the response to the administrator. And then generally the administrator will call the parent and say, if you want to come in, or we need you to come in. And if they don't come in, then the response that is taken is that student's not responding, right? The student is given always has to be given due process. Always has to be given due process about a particular situation. And therefore they're offered that, whether that's in person on a one-on-one or if it's with the parent.
But I guess to my question is that where should that be outlined more clearly in our policy?
I don't particularly think so.
Why not?
As a policy check, I don't think that's policy. I think that's the law. And when it's not like an internal variant policy. So I don't see it as a policy layout. Like kids in public school, we're entering a system, right? And that system has certain legal responsibilities. So the question is, we need to make clear to parents what it means to be part of a public school. How do you do that? But I just don't think it's policy work and very more obligations.
Because
That's
we
fine.
couldn't override law.
That's fine if that's the case, and I don't doubt it, but where I always go to is, and it kind of goes to our theme of communication, is I think in some way, shape, or form, we need to make sure parents are educated on the process, on the rights, that we can pull your kid out of a classroom, we can start questioning, the kid can refuse, and then the process continues. I think that's where we get into trouble, because it's not clear and people don't necessarily understand.
I mean, I don't mean to, but as a parent, listen, in all honesty, I got the phone call this year, right? My son was in the vice principal's office. I wasn't the slightest, I was a little surprised by the behavior, but I wasn't surprised by the fact that they pulled him out of the classroom and asked him questions, right? He goes to school there and he didn't, maybe broke a rule or whatever, and they questioned him. And then he didn't really answer, and they called me. As a parent in a public school, I just kind of expect it.
There are parents that will disagree with you. There are parents that are incredibly litigious, and there are parents that want to know what their rights are and what the process
And
is.
that being said, they were
So- Yeah.
very cooperative and it all worked out.
There's also
Look, maybe I'm going down the wrong path here, but I'm, in the
Yeah.
spirit of providing information and feedback from a community standpoint, I think it's important based on what's been brought up to me over the course of the year, and yelling and screaming and all kinds of other scenarios. And I don't disagree with you. Like, if I got a call from a principal, I'd be like, okay, what'd you do? But, other parents very much focus, and some of it depends on an age standpoint, but, parents focus on their rights and their kids' rights. Mr. Sini.
We have policy 5520 that actually outlines pulling kids from class.
Okay.
Defines what each conduct is. And so maybe we need just to be a better way of communicating our policy to the parents so that they can look at, these are the practice. I mean, I'm flipping through for the first time, but there's 6 or 8.
Yes.
No, there's dozens of pages. I'm sorry, 34 pages of policy around this.
So that a policy is at the start of the year, parents and students, it's my understanding, have to sign off on the handbook. That's it, that policy.
So that this
That policy
reflects
is in
the
there.
handbook.
That policy is in there.
Well, the policy is referenced, just to be
Yes.
really clear, the
Linked.
policy is
Let me say
referenced in the
linked.
handbook.
Yes.
And it is in accordance with state law, and we just reviewed it the other week again.
Mrs. Best.
So I guess I'm wondering, are we looking for some way that we can better help the community understand what our process is, or what I have to agree with Ms. Worm. I'm shocked to hear that somebody thinks that their student can't be sent to the principal's office without them getting a phone call first, but that's just my own experience. That's not.
It's
I
not
don't mean it
necessarily.
as a judgment.
It's not necessarily it's that, it's what's been referred to by parents as an interrogation.
Okay.
And again,
So-
parental words that have been used. So being called to the principal's office and then parents understanding what the process is once in the principal's office in terms of an investigation that needs to happen. I think that's where, again, I'm just approaching it from a communication standpoint and making sure people understand the facts. I have no issue with kids being pulled out of school and being part of an investigation, but
Okay.
there's
So I was
a
just
there's
trying
a
to understand where we're
communication
trying to go.
piece that's missing.
And then I'm curious also what we see as the relationship between our discipline policies and deterrence. And is that a question here as well? Is there any concern that parents or students aren't understanding well enough what the repercussions might be of their behaviors? And that should be made clearer to them, or do we believe that that works as deterrence? I'm not
So-
that's a question.
So there are also, I won't be flippant about it, but there are also some basic things of standards of behavior that we expect kids to be able, listen, they understand, they're in high school, some of them understand it. Now, there are some who don't, right, not exclusively, but there are certain aspects of behavior we don't need to delineate. Yet we sort of have, like disrespectful behavior, that's in the policy too. But there are certain levels of conduct and behaviors you would expect as parents. I would expect as administration to expect of our kids at particularly that level. Because if you look at the other schools levels, they come up, but they're not as prevalent clearly. But there are some basic levels that we don't need to delineate that this is not acceptable.
So could I just offer, in terms of the need for communication, I think it's incumbent upon the board and how we communicate to parents. So if parents are upset or they feel that something's not fair, to Mr. Cheney's point, we have a policy we can refer them to. We have a chain of command we can refer them to. If we can say, read this policy, this is what dictates it. If they say, well, I don't feel like this happened. Okay, well, here's your chain of command. It's really not a board level intervening. It's a board saying, here are your pathways. Your pathway is to understand the policy, and your pathway is to understand your chain of communication. I mean, that to me is from a board level what to do. Administratively, when schools hold welcome back or read the handbook or sign off on the handbook, there are administrative ways that they may want to communicate. But from our standpoint, I think it should be reinforced to parents that we work on policy, and then we offer up the chain of communication for parents so they know how to escalate their concerns The escalation is not to go to a board member and say, and I'm just using your words, it may have been a completely made up scenario, my child's been interrogated. There's nothing an individual board member can do about that. So I just think we would be really good if we all agreed on the pathways we would give to parents. And then if one of those fails, then there's board action. If a policy has been broken, if a chain of communication is not working, then there's a board discussion to have.
Mr. Brown.
So we had a conversation earlier about a communication subcommittee and the first work. I respectfully submit perhaps it should be looked at as the second line of work for such a committee to maybe think about how we push that out and make sure the messaging is available to the parents.
Good thought. Mrs. Shannon, Mrs. Jill.
Yeah, I'll answer that. One of the things I think we also encounter, Alan, you use the words clear expectations, and I think we have generational differences in clear expectations. So in our generation and older, you got suspended or kicked out of school. There was no such thing as restorative practice, right? And so I think one of the things that we encounter is when we do have disciplinary issues that bubble up to a level of interest in the community, there is generally an expectation, okay, well, that should result in oftentimes an out of school response. I think it is also important for the board to understand, and maybe you could talk for a minute, Alan, about how that often today is considered, or Chris or Shirley, that's actually one of the last things we want to do for a variety of reasons, that we don't really suspend and expel kids the way that schools used to when we were in them.
I don't know if I would make that statement.
Okay.
Because I think the idea of restorative practices, they're not mutually exclusive from consequences as well. And many times they go hand in hand, but I just don't know if I would make that statement.
Okay.
If I'm understanding the question.
So it's my understanding that we are less likely to use an out of school method of
That's the
discipline.
legislation's changed, I think 2015, 2014. That
So
changed that. Yeah.
for out of school, yes, that's true. That would be, that would.
We have
result
the
in in-school.
inability to.
Yeah.
Based
Yes.
on the
Yes.
legislation.
Right. Okay. So I think that there is a lack of understanding about that. And so oftentimes our parents get upset because they're expecting, whether they're educated or not, they're expecting a suspension, or they're expect out of school suspension, or they're expecting an out of school or an expulsion. So I think that that's one of the things that we encounter, is that what the parental expectation is doesn't match the action because circumstances have changed. So I think it's something that all of us, as we go out as individuals, not only can we point to the chain of command and the policy, but we can also talk about this change.
So the other, just a caveat, my own caveat, not yours on that comment, is I think we need to be careful explaining to parents why there was a consequence or not. It's not really, it sometimes is a community conversation, but that doesn't mean that we need to satisfy it. Now, there have been some high profile cases in my time on the board where the community really feels like they have an interest and they want to know. So maybe finding a way to communicate politely that their desire to know cannot always be matched with the ability to tell them. But just because people expect an expulsion doesn't mean that we need to explain to them why there wasn't one. Like, there's just a really thin line there. I mean, I'd be more concerned about the parent and the child in the situation, or any ancillary child to the situation. But I certainly have felt the pressure of chair in some of these more high profile cases. People are like, well, I want to know what happened, or I don't think what happened is enough. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, but it doesn't mean you're entitled to all the details. And that's been a really difficult message to say respectfully to people, but it is the truth. So the only caveat I would say, and I agree with Mrs. McCammon, that people are like, well, just suspend them, and we can't. Even if someone thought that was appropriate, it's not always the answer. But the first question is, well, I don't really get to tell you. And as a board member, I don't know what the punishment is. I think people often assume the board members know.
Well, that's
We
the point,
don't.
right? We is not we.
Yes, we is not we.
Right.
Agreed. And so I don't think we have to satisfy curiosity, or this board doesn't have to sit here solve today for curiosity, because we don't know.
Mr. Maroney.
I just kind of want to take this back a few steps and be less specific. And so I think, Dr. Adley, you were talking about that you think the giving the kids clear expectations has resulted in less disciplinary actions. And Chris, you referenced the fact that the goal is to have less repeat offenders. So I guess my question is, we've seen a reduction of that. Are we sure that we've seen a reduction of disciplinary actions. So is that a result of setting the clear expectations? Is that a result of the pandemic? And do we think that that will continue, especially as we do more DEI work and things like that? Do we expect that trend to continue? And then my second part of my question is, do we see repeat offenses occurring amongst the same people, or have those declined at the same rate or greater than the norm?
So I don't know that, I'm sorry, do you want to speak?
Go ahead, you can go first.
I don't know that I can draw a direct correlation. I can say it's certainly the period of the pandemic is attributed, I think, to some of the reduction but at the same time we were in school, right? So I think it's contributed something to it, but again, I just don't see the direct correlation. But we do look at offenses. We look at the stories behind the offenses, right? It's important to know when, like, for instance, a student said something or was disrespectful or otherwise. Well, where was he before it? How did it occur? When, like, where did it happen? What preceded that? How was it handled afterwards? I mean, we look at all of those situations to try and make sure that we're trying to be responsive to those, not just administer the consequence, which we'll administer if necessary. But all of those are looked at individually, Dennis.
Oh, the repeat offenders, so to speak, that's common. So when we talk about the 44 incidents, that's not 44 different students. That could be probably 30 students, but several students that have multiple suspension. And the other piece is, I know the word restorative, some people think is a soft word, but retributive is my word of the day. So I'm going to take it, Mr. Brown. What is restorative to one student is retributive to another, because some students would rather take a suspension than have to sit and do 4 hours of community service, right? Mm-hmm. But again, the ultimate goal, I'll say the ultimate goal is to prevent the behavior from happening in the first place, right? But we know we're not always there. So whatever that consequence is going to be, whether it be directly related to what the offense is, or whether it is, you did this, that means you're suspended, you just don't want it to happen again. And different things work for different people. And that's why it's not a one size fits all. And the same thing with progressive. If the student does something the first time, it's not necessarily the same consequence they're going to get the third time. So they might have a retributive, and that's a great word also, because punitive is typically the word you would use with discipline. And I think that's a better word. You might start there and then work towards a more restorative approach until you find what works. And from years of being an assistant principal, you spend most of your time with a very specific percentage of the students in the building, and you keep working with them and you build relationships, and hopefully you work to a place that you've helped them successfully navigate their high school experience.
If I can talk candidly for a moment, just to give you a practical example of where we're learning from what we're doing. We've had ongoing discussions about, well, some of our students have come and spoken, right, about issues of diversity and inclusion. We've had discussions at the high school about there are serious consequences for some other infractions. Are the consequences that we're given and the learning opportunities we're given for these as equal as that? Because the infraction itself is just as significant. So those are some things as an example that we've reflected on and making some modifications as we go. I do believe that young people, particularly high school, they expect something, right? They expect that, listen, to be held accountable. In fact, if they don't, I think we're doing them a disservice. Now, when holding them accountable means we want them to learn from it. And we don't want them to be repeating it, but there is an expectation that from our young people that, yes, you will guide me, you will hold me accountable. And the idea of lifting them up at the same time, they're just not mutually exclusive ideas. That's what you want administrators to do. I can tell you that the high school administration do a tremendous job trying to really reflect on how do we get students to learn from this situation. But that shouldn't be equated to be, we're weak, they're not giving them enough significant consequences. And I'll just reiterate, in the time that I've been here, trying to look at individual cases, I can look anyone in the eye of this board, any parent, any situation, and say we've tried to be fair to your kids and consistent with the pattern that has preceded it.
Any other board questions, comments? All right, thank you.
I just may add one thing to it, Mr. Deneen, in response to what Dr. Adley said earlier, the individual nature. So there is another opportunity just for students who under IDA do have an IEP. It's called a manifestation determination. Many members may be aware of this, but the manifestation determination is a PPT that's held to see if there's a nexus between the behavior and what the learning difference is. So for instance, if there's a student who has an infraction, you do have to consider the nature of that learning difference. If it's a student who has pragmatic language issues or may not be able to really understand nuance or inference and may speak out in a way that's not appropriate and it would mean an infraction, the PPT needs to go back and consider that. And if it is a nature or if it is a nexus between their learning difference and the behavior, what do we need to attend to that? There's still a response. Do we need to increase behavior training? Do we need to add a service? What do we need to do? So that is done. And it's also done with children who might have another need under the different 13 categories. So that's called a manifestation determination. It is part of due process and it's held within 15 days, 10 days actually.
Thank you, Mrs. Klein.
I would also agree that the best thing, that the most helpful thing to me personally and administrators in general personally, whether you have your own independent opinion on it, is to pass it through the system, through the chain of communication. That is the best thing that you can do, and most helpful thing that you can do. It doesn't mean to say you can't understand contextually at some point, right? Patterns of behaviors or otherwise, but that's the most helpful thing to do.
All right, moving on. Discussion of draft board goals and strategic plan. Dr. Adley, Dr. Tranberg.
We had a wee discussion this morning when Patrice was here just about the nature of the goals. This sort of falls into that. I'll be quick and just share that the strategic plan goals also feed a little bit and inform the board goals. But what I've done here is literally, I think 7's too many. First of all, I've listed 7 opportunities. They're not like, well, why are you listing them? I'm just giving suggestions, and I would like to get some direction as to how you feel you would like to move forward with these or other ones, and then I would bring back at the next meeting a draft of measurements, actions, and so on and so forth. That there may be things that are not on this list that you would like to do or otherwise, but it could be communication or not. Anyway, I just left them as a list, literally, of as starter suggestions that might be helpful to the board.
Mrs. McCammon.
Thank you for getting it started. I found this to be actually a great start. Number 6, I'd like to just change to enhance board and district communications. I know sometimes those are the same thing, but as we talked this morning, there may be times when they're not. Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
Sorry, Alan, just to go back, I read the memo and I was a little confused. So just to clarify, so these are the board goals we're working to develop now. And so these are the superintendent's suggestion for the goals the board should have, or I'm just trying to understand where
Yeah,
the delineation
this is just provided ideas that the board might want to consider just based on discussions that have ensued, past practices, the past year, the future year looking forward. So there's no need to take action on this today or otherwise. And if any other ideas, I'm certainly, they're board goals. So
Okay, and just in the timeline, where do you see your goals coming in or deriving from this, or are they separate track? Or I'm just trying to understand the board lane versus the superintendent
I
lane.
think, are you talking about my own personal goals?
Well, not personal, but it's in your
Well,
your capacity as superintendent.
personally professional goals,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So there are the strategic plan lays out a certain direction, and we're going to go talk about the superintendent performance in executive session. I'm happy to, I think there needs to be alignment, right? And so therefore, I would also be soliciting the input as part of the process. What goals would you like me to have also in terms of that will support some of those?
Okay.
So I think to Mr. Brown's question, you've outlined some potential board goals which should align or play into the overall strategic plan. And then are you looking at the strategic plan that continuing to be kind of the district goals that you're continuing to move forward?
Well, these are, yes, these are the district goals that we've
Is that
district
kind of
areas.
where your
I
question
was
is
just
at,
trying to
Dave?
figure, like, are we coming up together with a joint plan, or
Yes.
we're gonna come with something to the board, Alan's coming with something later, just trying to figure out.
There,
what
there
the
should be
plan is, that's
there
all.
should be alignment between all of the components.
So
Mrs.
what I,
Ackman.
oh, sorry.
Mrs. Ackman had her hand up.
So I appreciate that some of these are more the 9-member board goals, but what I am missing in here is the board as the purveyor of the district goals. And I do see number 5, enhancing, challenging mathematics instruction for students, but really our job as a board is to make sure education is moving forward. And I don't really see that. Typically, we then tie that into district goals and you give us quarterly updates and we can measure where we are. These are measurable amongst the 9 of us. They're not really measurable as a district. I would also offer that advancing the elementary school building projects is, I mean, we can do that, but rightfully that is the town's job and they've put together a good building committee and they're doing it. That's not really a goal that we can act upon. Certainly if they ask for our input, we'll be right there for them, but it's not really an actionable board goal. I find these a little too insular to the board and some of them are good. And I'm just saying generally, I'm missing a little bit of what Mr. Brown is talking about too, the tie into the district, how to measure up where we are educationally, how are we moving the district forward? I understand the strategic plan is the long-range plan, but the annual plan, I think the board goals need to encompass a little more of that without getting into the weeds. There is a happy medium, but I am missing those here.
Mrs. Parent.
So what I took from Patrice this morning was that the board goals are what the 9 of us can do together. And then the district goals, it's a tricky, the verbiage is tricky, but are the district goals the year 2 strategic plan goals? So I agree that, the elementary school building projects, not something the 9 of us can do right now. So should those go into year 2 strategic plan goals? And the same thing with number 5, with the mathematics, is that again into enhancing teaching and learning, that goes into goal 1. I don't know, I just think we need to be a little more separate what the 9 of us can do and what the district can do.
Mr. Brown.
I would just follow up to that the strategic plan that we agreed to, I think part of us representing the community and representing changes that have gone on since we adopted, part of our role as a board might be to consider that strat plan here and maybe making, trim changes, adjustments to that in light of what's gone on. And that should be something we should, change the areas of focus perhaps, if you will, or put less focus on certain parts of the strategic plan as we work through the next year and have those as goals to work on with the administration. Promulgate those as goals for the administration.
Yes, Dr.
Mr. Brown, we can say what's going on. What do you mean?
Well, we just had a little pandemic thing. That's what I was referring to. It's-
Okay, all right, okay.
Yeah, and no, just really, but in all seriousness, I think when you look at some of what we've seen in test scores, some of what we've seen in remediation, some of what we've seen in mental health, some of those are certainly more in the forefront than we saw when this plan was adopted. I think it would suit the board well to really consider that where we are as we look at what our goals are over the next year in terms of remediation and making sure we promote the excellence of our student body.
Yeah, just to
Mr.
follow
Zine.
up, we didn't have a suicide crisis when we developed the strategic plan, so I see it in the board goals, but to Dave's point, we might want to tweak the strategic plan and make that more obvious as a goal for the next school year, which was not present only a year ago, to the extent, if you will.
Yes, and under wellness, that's where it would lie. So that's what we would play out there, and sort of took the next step of just pulling it out to profile it.
But as part of our conversation, I might suggest that in goal number 2, wellness, diversity, and inclusion, we spent a lot of time on the diversity and inclusion. And perhaps maybe we need to pivot more to wellness as we look forward to our work in this coming year. So we spent a big focus on that last year. I would suggest as a board we consider whether that same focus should be here or we should perhaps emphasize on wellness. We're looking forward to the next year.
Well,
So the
I just-
strategic plan year 2 goals, the first one under goal 2 is to identify and incorporate a systematic approach to address social and emotional learning.
Correct.
It's about promoting wellness as the first item there, right? So that's,
Right.
as I understand it, that's how we act against the strategic plan, is it has the room for us to focus on what we need to focus
Yes.
on each year, rather than having to go back and revamp the plan. We revamp our strategies to deliver against the plan.
That's fair, yes.
But it sounds like there's a request on the table to go back and look at the strategic plan, unless I'm misunderstanding.
No, I think you definitely have that. That's why I talked about sort of trim tabs or making adjustments to that. There may perhaps be one of these goals or not that we want to remove or something we want to add. But I think as we look forward to our work and we compare what we did over last year, there may be adjustments we want to make, which is to your point. I think, yeah, we may want to have adjustments. But am I proposing at this point to put anything on or take anything off? No. I'm just highlighting that, just looking at the high level goal here as one sentence, not the detail you're looking at. But that would be one example. Perhaps we should change the pivot.
So is it also, I think, to what I'm hearing across all the comments, you know, from a board perspective, and I think simple is best. You know, I think we've defined there's work to be done and the district's doing work on safety and security. I do agree. I think the school building project is just part of the day-to-day operations, and it's more about, do they need anything from us if anything changes? So I think it's from a board perspective, I think it's safety and security. I think it's the ongoing implementation of the strategic plan, but within that, is there any direction we need to give the administration on how we think stuff within the strategic plan needs to pivot or prioritize based on what we've learned over the last year? You know, some of the DII work has been done, but clearly mental health has kind of risen to the top. I think the mathematics thing is just, again, day-to-day in the strategic plan, execution on curriculum. And I think what we discussed, you know, district and board communications, I think is key at the board level. So I just see kind of the high level 3 or 4 bullets from a board perspective, but then defining, especially when it comes to the strategic plan, where we need to pivot or prioritize based on, I think, the work that needs to be done.
And I'm not going to use the word of the day, but this is
Yeah.
a year. What was your word? I forgot.
Prioritize.
Prioritize.
Yes, I didn't use my word.
I know. But, you know, prioritize that short list, if you
Right.
will. in
So
that- in
may I
that-
s-
To me, it's about, again, I go back to Tara, part of my comment this morning was, we have a lot going on. And I used the word pause, which created a whole nother conversation. Decided not to use that word pause because the district doesn't pause, and I agree. But I feel I'm at the point now where, you know, we've got so much going on and so much has happened that how do we prioritize and how do we make sure we're continuing to execute on what I think are the core tenets of what we need to deliver on, which is education, which is mental health, which is security, which is whatever we need to implement from a curriculum standpoint based on changes, state standards, or what's up for review. And then, you know, I think to a comment Dave made, you know, I constantly want to hear about what are we seeing, feeling, or hearing from our students on the remediation side of it, right? And it may be not what we think it is. It may be better, you know, in certain instances it may be worse, but like that would be a subset of, you know, how are we doing results wise and stuff like that. So.
And the state had a number, again, something we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Tom spent, what, an hour and a half with us?
Right.
Going through some state initiatives over the next 2 school years that are going to have to be.
Yeah, Mrs. Hoffman.
So the way I've always looked at board goals, and so a suggestion for looking at them this year is true up to our mission statement. What can we measure annually? I love that we have the strategic plan as the long term. So my thing is, if you look at your number one, of course, right? We can evaluate and maximize security. We can actually decide where we are and look at where we are at the end of the year. And we can decide whether we think we've done enough, too much, in the middle, like you can measure that. Number 2, you can measure, right? And that clearly has come up. I mean, I don't know if we have any other way to say that, screaming at us that we need to do that. Number 3, I think enough people have said maybe that's not on the table. It's our job to oversee the strategic plan, so that seems good to me. enhancing mathematics, to me, that personally should be like enhancing appropriately challenging instruction for all students. I don't think it's just mathematics. That is a yearly goal, and we should be looking to the good conversation that clearly happened that we don't pause. We are always looking at challenging mathematics. Enhancing district communication seems to have been of interest, and considering professional growth or budget goal result, okay, I kind of get that one, but that's fine. We can do that one. But what I just don't want to miss out on this when we true up is our job is to make sure our schools are working for kids. And do we have measurable goals that we can say over the long haul, with our strategic plan, this is what we want for our kids? I think we do. We've got that in the vision of graduate. An annual goal. What are we doing over the course of the school year to enhance our kids' educational experience, or to ensure, maybe it's not even enhanced, to ensure our kids are having a strong educational experience? So I know this is just a draft, and I thank Dr. Adley for putting it together, but that's how I look at it when I see a goal. If it's not about enhancing our children's education, or if we were in a really poor fiscal situation, really getting out of it, then we're not meeting our responsibilities. Those are our responsibilities.
The way I sort of evaluate goals is that they have to do with who's accountable. And as a board, I'm willing to be accountable for number one, for number two. I think 4 is just a job description, but it's worth pulling out at this point. 3 is arguable, but in that we're lending a board resource, we do have a role, but I'm fine if it's not in here. Number 5, I find, unless we've decided that the board has something specific it wants to focus on, I find it. If we want to say there's something we want to do around mathematics, I'm happy to support that, but I think it probably belongs in the strategic plan. And then I'd like to keep the communications goal. So I guess I'm comfortable with 1, 2, 4, and 6.
Yeah,
Mrs. Parent,
I would
sorry.
agree. I would agree with Jill. And I think, just think the last one, is there something that a budget goal that came out of our discussion this morning? Is there something that would be, to me, that would be more general, that's, to support and provide the resources necessary for, whatever. I don't know. I guess I'm asking, does anybody have a specific budget goal or anything coming out of this morning that feels like it needs to be added?
No, and I do think, go ahead, Mr. Sini.
My bad. No, I think some of the initiatives Tom brought up, that I forgot the coordinator
Right,
role that
family
we
care,
talked
yeah.
to, sorry.
Family
Tom,
coordinator.
Family coordinator. Dr. Adley even called out, that might fit in there. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, could you word it as, to support
Stated.
the state resources required by the state, or I don't know. Is that even necessary to be in there because we
Well,
have to do it?
But I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
to maybe Tara's point too, when you think about it, Dave is, was always, got this on point too. It's the measurable component of it. So I think that family coordinator is kind of a key ingredient to executing on the mental health because of their interaction with the psychologists, the social workers, the teachers. And then that plays into, are there some measurables out of there like Tara Worm has brought up as to caseloads and how students are progressing and that type of stuff. So maybe that's a component of it.
Well, I think hiring that person is important, but I think it belongs in the strat plan.
It's also statutory, like we don't have a
Yeah,
choice.
and
Yeah.
I'm with you. I agree. It probably doesn't really believe in board goals, but I almost think that based on this morning's conversation, it needs to be part of that.
Yes.
The only other thing there, that it would likely come under number 2 as a strategy for number 2 too.
Yeah.
Well,
But then that, to me, I agree. Number 2 is number 2, but then what you deliver and how you organize it falls in the strategic plan in terms of finding or hiring that person and how are we going to measure that person's success, right?
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mrs. Achman.
I guess I'm totally looking at it very differently, which is fine. Hiring someone as part of a budget is a budget decision and an annual decision. It's not a strategic goal. Unless you're not hiring this budget season, you say, I want to work myself up.
There's a role, we're required to hire statutorily,
I know.
hire or appoint. So,
Yeah, so we are required to, and
It's not a goal.
it's not really a goal.
Right.
We'll have to find the money to do it.
Yeah,
So-
but I think Yes.
it may be one of the factors by which we meet the goal. So I guess that's where I started. I see, take number 2, for example. Number 2 is a good board goal. It is then up to the district to tell us how we're going to do it. And to Mrs. McCammon's point, it is then up to the board to hold the district accountable for achieving and push upon the plan.
What resources are needed?
What resources, are they budgetary? Are they just changing staff? Do we like the plan? Do we have concerns? We're on annual goals. These aren't, and the annual goals should true back to the goal over long-term goals in the strategic plan, but I wouldn't go fiddling other than to act on the first steps in the strategic plan and decide, is this still our first step? Or do we have new determining factors that would move steps around in it?
Thank you. Mrs. Best.
2 things. The first, I just would point out that 1 and 2 do potentially sound like they might lead to budget initiatives for next year. Just call that out. But this might be a terrible idea, but I was looking back at my notes from when we were going through the self-evaluation and looking at trying to come up with a professional growth goal for the board. There were a few points made that we could do better at creating more linkages with community groups. We had a number of conversations about how we take input from the community. I don't know if there's something around working as a board to improve how we receive input or how we connect with the community. And I mean that beyond to communicate, not our messages getting out to people, but more about how we take input in. And like I said, it might be a terrible idea, but they kind of seem to connect it. So I thought it was worth
For me,
mentioning.
Julie, that's 6. That's
We're
the
just
district
waiting for you to
communication
make
part.
communication.
No?
Yeah.
I think it rolls up into that. Yeah.
For me.
Mr. Brown.
Just following up on Mrs. Hawkins' comment a moment ago, and not to use the pause word, but when you look at the scope of what's in the strategic plan and the idea of how we map out, there may be changes where we focus, de-emphasize, emphasize. And I think that's part of what we have to do because there are limited capacities here, and that's our role as we set policies. We're just going to measure the implementation and success by the admin, but we may say, a little less of that, a little more of that, which I think is a big part of what we have to do in this exercise, setting those goals for the year based on changes.
Mrs. Parent.
Bring up another separate idea, which I mentioned in my evaluation, but I don't think we touched on it this morning, was that, I think a lot of us do professional development for ourselves in terms of board, doing the CABE webinars or attending legislative breakfasts or whatever it is that we all do. I don't know what anybody else does. So could we figure out a way to add a goal about our own professional development and as it relates to Board of Education, not our, external jobs, but and how do we report back what we learn to the other 8 members that we sit with?
I think it's a good point in that some of the stuff that I've attended or Jill and I have attended, I know even Tara and I attended stuff previously and kind of reporting back to that, or what does our involvement look in what does our involvement look like in some of those organizations and how can we affect change if we want to?
That's a little bit ties in with your point about linkages. I think maybe we could sort of attack your point in 2 different ways. There could be talking more explicitly about our connection to CABE and the various things, including professional development. So kind of looking at us at the state level and sort of our state interaction. And then I think about the mental health, maybe a portion of when we look at how we do with the mental health, we can't, as we talked about, do that on our own. So in order to say that we're successful, we will have to have had healthy relationships with a lot of different entities. So maybe when we talk about that goal, we can incorporate looking at ourselves and how well we're doing on that. Because I agree it's an important part of being an effective board.
So, Mr. Brown.
Sorry, Ms. Parent, just following up on that, the sort of, self-improvement, like a CABE event, that's subject matter expertise, let's say, on Board of Ed or schools, what's the scope of what you see for personal development, I guess?
Just how do you educate yourself about, the webinars are about, I don't know, whatever the new legislation is or whatever, how do you deal with conflict at a board table? There's some nuggets from those things that are helpful. And how do we
recent one around negotiations
Right.
too.
There's some good information that somebody else at the table may want to have, but how do we get that to everybody?
So there's a governance aspect as well.
Mr. Rudel, a real important question for you. Is there any more air conditioning you can find somewhere?
We did cut the PO yesterday, so.
Oh, so we're just waiting on the equipment to be delivered? All right. So kind of, I'll try and recap this. So it looks like from a board goal standpoint, just at a high level, and we can tweak it a little bit. I hear a majority of people comfortable with 1, 2, 4, and 6. That kind of, are we in agreement with that? I think we could spend some time understanding kind of some of the measurement behind that. And then I think, you know, Dr. Adley and team, I don't know, I'd like to understand if there's a prioritization within the strategic plan or anything that we do want to kind of move around or change. Because I feel there's some priorities to certain things, you know, around mental health, the beginning of the school year. I think security will address over the course of the summer, but I think that's something I'd like to understand a little more. There's a lot of work in process, a lot of work streams, but is there anything we need to shift or prioritize? And as always, what resources you may need to do that. Or add. Well, yeah, is there anything we need to add or delete? And then is there anything we need to prioritize? That make sense?
Yep.
Dr. Allen?
Yep. So for the next regular meeting, I'll bring back a draft 1, 2, 4, and 6 with strategies and measurements. Is that okay?
Yeah.
As a draft?
Good, thank you. Good conversation.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
very much.
everyone. So with that, I will move to adjourn to executive session for the purpose of discussion of the performance of the superintendent of schools pursuant to Connecticut General Statute 1-200-6A. Do I have a motion? Mr. Maroney, second by Mr. Senior. All those in favor? Thank you. So we will now move into executive session.